Welcome to the Does Anything Matter podcast, where Patrick and Pepin talk about the most age-old question of does anything actually matter? So today we're going to talk about altruism and whether altruism is inherently good. Now, in conjunction, we'll probably talk about selfishness. Now, we don't plan these conversations ahead of time, so who knows where it's going to go. But we'll just feel it out and see what happens. So, I mean, just on the face of it, Patrick, what's your opinion on... Actually, so let's start with definitions. What is altruism?
So, I think altruism, selfishness are subjective anyway, but when you ask me that, what I'll do is I'll provide the framework for what most people assume that it is, right? So, when we talk about altruism, we're talking about someone being selfless. Right, so the opposite of selfishness. If you're altruistic, then you are generally giving. You want to help the downtrodden, people who can't help themselves, and you sort of distribute your own resources around, right? Whether that's your time or your money or your goodwill.
So with altruism, what you're saying is it's like someone does something for the benefit of others and not for themselves.
Yeah, that's an accurate summation.
Okay, and the thing that's a little bit confusing with that is there's instances of where people might behave in a way that might seem altruistic, but maybe it's not. Like, for instance, someone who has a lot of money, who's walking out of a club, might throw lots of money in the air, and it's like, yeah, guys, take whatever you want. But he's trying to show off his wealth, right? Or she, but tends to be men, and stereotypically. So that is maybe altruistic in nature, but maybe it's not actually altruistic because the intent is different?
Yeah, so I don't think that's altruism. I think that's showmanship. And I think that people can benefit from it, but there are plenty of instances where you can ride coattails, right? And so you might even say in the corporate world that somebody who works with a manager who's really successful maybe doesn't have to work as hard because they are riding the coattails a little bit. So that's kind of similar to getting somebody's throwing money in the air and you just happen upon it, right? You just happen upon a situation where you are working with somebody that is progressing you because they're getting results, right? That's not altruistic. That person who's getting the results is actually doing it for selfish reasons.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that could go into a whole conversation about, is altruism inherently selfish, which it would be interesting. We'll probably get there in a second. But one thought I had, another hypothetical question. Let's say that, an instance of someone just throwing money into the air, just to random people, that's not like targeted, right? So that's a display of wealth because it's they don't really care what they're doing. The whole thing is just throwing money in the air. But let's say that somebody builds a bunch of wells in Africa, right? And these are communities that don't have wells, and he just built on all the wells. But you ask him about why he's doing it, and he's built the most wells of anybody ever. And he just says that he wants to have the Guinness World Record for most wells built. He wants to be known as the best well builder ever.
So it's exactly the same as throwing the money. It's not altruism. It's like showboating, but someone happens to benefit from it.
Okay, it's a little bit different though, because in the case of just throwing money, it benefits random people, but it's not targeted, right? There's not some end. In this other case, he has he has an aim, but he takes the aim which is going to benefit the most people, I guess, or maybe it's the aim where he's most able to express that want of his.
So I think that could be, it could be considered charitable, right? You could use the word charitable, but the word altruism by definition is an act of selflessness, right? Okay, yeah. So if your intent is to make the Guinness Book of World Records, you actually don't care if those wells result in, utility for other people. It's just that you want the world record, right? So it's not altruism. It's still charity and it's still beneficial to somebody, but it's not altruism by definition. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. Well, it's like, let's say someone is trying to cure cancer and they want to do that because they want to be world renowned and have their name on buildings and stuff. Certainly their curing of cancer is good and it's great that they're trying to do that, but they're not doing it to save humanity. They're doing it for their own vanity.
Right. And while this distinction might seem frivolous right now, where it becomes important is when the benefit is stripped away from the benefactor, right? So if the person building the wells, all of a sudden, Guinness Book calls him up and says, we don't recognize this as a world record anymore, so it actually doesn't matter, then what's in it for the person building the wells? right? Will they keep building the wells because their primary motivation was to get recognized?
Yeah, okay. So there's a sort of self-reinforcement factor you have to look at. Like, is there something that benefits this person that would cause them to not do it if they didn't get that benefit?
Right. So going back to the example of the person working for a corporation. Now, there are people that benefit from this person's achievements and their leadership, but are they doing it to develop the people under them, or are they doing it for advancement? And so the difference between an altruistic person who is just developing people because they want to see them advance, and then a person who's doing it for self-gain, is that if the next day they're told that they've reached the pay cap, so they can't get a raise now, and they can't be promoted because of whatever reason, right? They now have no motivation to get better. So why would they try to push anybody else to improve?
Mm-hmm. Right. So we've talked about altruism. So altruism, charity, they're somewhat tangential, but they're different in that intent, right?
Yeah.
So someone who is altruistic has no real intent for themselves, at least. They have intent for others, but not for themselves. I mean, that's at least the colloquial definition of it. And a way of thinking about this maybe is like it's the difference between, say, donating $50 million to some sort of charity, and putting your name on that, and donating $50 million to charity and not putting your name on it and making it very anonymous. Like, anonymous donations have much more of an altruistic kind of nature to them because you can't tie them back to who did it.
Right. There's no recognition or real reward to the person who did it other than the fact that they feel altruistic.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, you could say, and this is going to get to the whole debate here, I mean, is the fact that the person wants to feel like they're being altruistic selfish in itself?
It could be. I don't think inherently, but it definitely could be. I think that Ayn Rand would have something to say about this, too, if she was here, because she did think that altruism was evil in its face, which is interesting because that's the opposite of how we define it and how most people would see it. But that definition actually, it opens the discussion for kind of where we're going with this, which is that not all altruism really is, by definition, selfless. Mm.
Is there any sort of like, say, altruistic so there's two different things there, right? So either altruism is awesome, it's terrible, or it doesn't exist, right? Obviously, if it doesn't exist, it can't be awesome or terrible. It's just another facet of selfishness. It's just a facet of selfishness that we agree is maybe good.
Right. So the question is, does it exist or is it an interpretation, right? And if it exists, is it good or bad? Mm-hmm. And that's really what we're trying to get to here.
So now that we have the framework here, I think selfishness is pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the converse, obviously, and we don't really need to explain that because it's the opposite of everything we just said.
So what's your opinion? Does altruism exist?
I think it exists.
Okay.
But I think it's rare. I think that what most people consider altruism is actually charity, but the charity has strings attached. So let me put it this way. I don't remember exactly where I heard this. It was in a psychology class I took at some point when I was in college. But basically, what the research shows is that out of 100% of people in society, essentially about 30% of them are going to think on what we call like a pre-conventional moral reasoning. And what that means is that they only think about themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's just how they reason through things. Everything that you say to them passes through the filter of how does this affect me? So that's about 30% of people. And then about 60% of people think on the just the average conventional level. And what this means is that we consider how society expects us to act, right? So you take any given action and you pass it through the filter of what does society say? What have I learned growing up in society? And then 10% of people think on the post-conventional level. And post-conventional asserts that morality is determined by the greater good, by what affects the whole of humanity, right? Now, these numbers might not be exact, but it gives us a general idea of how people think. And when it comes to altruism, it exists, but I believe it mostly exists within that 10% of people who think on the post-conventional level.
Okay, I'm trying to interpret this. So is this existing in the sense of like a psychological existence? Like, so for instance, like people have, let's say that someone has a delusion, right? And then they see things. Like, you could say that doesn't exist in reality, doesn't exist in some sort of actuality, but this does have an effect internally on them, and this is their own self-perception that's there. So
I think that altruism is an intent. So it's not a tangible existence, but it's like saying that a particular action is kind, right? And how do we define a kind action? We have sort of societal labels that we would say are, constitute kindness. And so altruism is a descriptor. It's the same way. An action can be altruistic. It's not in of itself like a construct. It's a way you describe an action. And I think that, again, the people that are in that 10% of postmodernist thinking would be capable of true altruistic action.
And what would make them capable explicitly?
So it's the moral reasoning process, and that process, again, related to the greater good. So those people who think of it like that might say that a particular action is being taken not because it benefits me, and not because it's what society expects, but because it has the greatest benefit or least detriment to society.
Right. So to draw a parallel here with, say, communism and socialism. So there's certain ideas in certain sects. There's hundreds of sects of like socialism and communism. So it's hard to like pin down anyone. But there's certain ones that will claim that the social society should be run by is it the proletariat, or what's the word? It's the people who are going to run it. There's a certain word.
Proletariat's correct.
Yeah, okay. So the proletariat. So they're supposed to be the runners of society, and that the proletariat should, in nature, be selected such that they don't value themselves, but they value like the greater good, society as a whole, and that these people would be, say, primarily utilitarian in nature. I mean, you could say primarily utilitarian. Maybe there's certain, caveats to that. But that's the goal of that kind of society. And you could say that in a lot of ways, socialism and communism tries to expound on the ideas of, say, altruism and selflessness.
So that's true in theory. However, I think that much of that comes down to propaganda, because it sounds great, but in practice it doesn't work. And I think that's been proven many times. And I know there's people that are going to disagree that communism is a failed system. Well, I mean, nowadays we call it socialism or democratic socialism or whatever you want to call it. So nobody really says communism anymore when we're talking about this type of political system. But ultimately that's what it leads to when you have a system that focuses on the collective. Now, when I'm saying altruism is a mindset of thinking of the greater good, that's true. But that rhetoric can also be used in ways to sort of brainwash individuals who don't think on the post-conventional level. Because again, only roughly 10% of people are capable of really reasoning through what is a post-conventional moral argument. So if you're saying to a pre-conventional person that we should do this because it's for the good of the collective, right? They might not be able to discern if that's a postmodernist argument or if that's propaganda. So this type of mentality can be dangerous when you're talking about doing it in a totalitarian way. That's what I'm trying to say, is that altruism, it can't be totalitarian. It has to be initiated by free will.
Oh, is that inherent in definition, or is that inherent in like positive altruism?
I think that it's inherent in the definition of altruism, because altruism has to be a selfless act, right? And once you introduce the idea of totalitarianism, then it's no longer an issue of it's now self-preservation, because if you're not willing to give yourself to the collective, then you'll become failed as an individual, right? So once you have a system like communism in place, now you have incentive for somebody to go along with the collective, which takes out the free will of altruism on its face.
I get what you're saying now. I agree. So I want to try to condense this. So communism, socialism, by definition, would not be altruistic because altruism is a give and someone receives, whereas a communist system is a two-way contract. I give, you receive, and then you give and I receive. It's a contract between two parties. So it's like if I gave you $20, that's one thing. But if I give you $20 and you're contractually obligated to do something with that $20, or you're contractually obligated to, like, say, do some work, that's a whole different kind of thing. It's like if I give someone a gift, that's one thing. If I give someone something in return for some benefit, or if they don't have an option not to receive that money or option not to do the thing that I want them to do, then that's not a situation where altruism can occur because there's no choice happening there. Now, the choice, maybe the person on the other side, the person who is able to dole out punishment or give resources, has some sort of choice there, maybe. But the person who is on the receiving end of that doesn't have any choice in that system. They're just kind of stuck in that system. It's involuntary. So it's an involuntary system which maybe has gift giving. It's not even gift giving.
No, it's collective labor, and so. Perhaps there would be a situation where you could have a post-conventional leader in a socialist economy, and this post-conventional leader has the type of wisdom that knows really what is best for the group, right? But that's a moving target, and there's no way that anybody can know what's best for every individual in a society. And so, by its definition, altruism would be, I can see what would benefit somebody else the best, and I'm willing to do it just on...
Well, I think a difference there, though, as well, is let's say that I'm leading a team, and I believe I know what's best for the team. And perhaps I do. Maybe I do have that insight and that kind of reasoning. My team is following me on a voluntary basis. If they disagree with my decision, they don't have to keep following me. They can just opt out, right? They can follow somebody else, or they can follow themselves. They can take their own path, right? There's no forced mandate that they follow what I'm saying. Whereas the case of a, say, socialist or communist regime, they have to follow what I'm saying regardless, whether they like it or not. They're a part of the system, and they can't get out of the system. They can't opt out.
Right. So there's an argument that any type of altruistic benefit that would have been obtained from the communist system is then stripped away with the loss of liberty and autonomy that is suffered by its citizens.
I would say it's not altruistic because there's an expectation on the other side, right?
Yes.
The expectation is that you stay within the system, that you don't rebel, or that you act in the way which the system dictates. And that system might be one in which you don't claim any property rights, or that there's also good tenets of, don't do harm to other people and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But there's, certain tenets which you obey, and in return, you get this benefit. And let's say this benefit is hypothetical because no system's worked out, as you said. But we could say that this is not an altruistic system, or this is not altruism because there is an exchange happening here. Whether that exchange is, right, wrong, or, just, that's another matter. But there's an exchange happening there, whereas in general altruism, there's no exchange. Or if there is an exchange, let's say someone's getting some sort of self-aggrandizement for it, or some sort of self-worth, gain from it, that exchange is so minimal it can be disregarded. Like if I give you $2 million as a benefit, or no, it's not you. Let's say I give St. Jude's Children's Hospital $2 million, anonymously. Maybe I get some benefit of feeling good about myself because, I know some kids are going to not die, and then I feel, oh yes, I'm a great person. But, the level of, say, selfishness that I accrue is so insignificant to the donation that you can just ignore it.
Yes, exactly. And of course, the benefit that you derive from it carries no expectation of return.
Yeah. St. Jude's doesn't have to do anything for me. Now, of course, maybe if I donate a lot of money to them, it's implied that they're going to give me my own wing. If I put my name on it and stuff, like I just keep giving them money. And I'm like, hey, I'll give you another $2 million. Man, I've always wanted my name on a building. Like maybe that's a circumstance where you can get something out of it, right? And that wouldn't be altruism because there's an expectation on the other side. Yeah,
exactly. So I mentioned Ayn Rand earlier, and I think that her perspective is relevant here because it really ties into this idea that altruism it does exist, but it was her opinion that altruism is actually the root of evil. And the reason being is because there's always expectation. And I mean, keep in mind that she came from Soviet Russia during a time when there was a lot of turmoil. So certainly that would have influenced her perspective. But is it worthy of examining, where we've seen not only Soviet Russia but other countries that have tried these systems that haven't succeeded? And so could it be that when we enter that collective mindset and we start to think that there ought to be things like distributive justice in our society, does that lead to collapse, and is it therefore evil?
I have no idea. It's a very, very high level question. There's certain historical answers you can give, but I don't think I'm capable of answering that question, because I think a problem is when you have such a high level concept being applied to a giant thing, you don't actually know if that concept is actually being applied in the way you think. Because it could always be claimed that this was not altruistic, this was actually selfishness. This was not this was that. This was con artistry, this was, lies, propaganda. This was good, this was bad. Like, there's many different judgments that can occur in those instances, and it's impossible to prove one or the other. I mean, you can maybe prove at certain instances, but as a collective whole, it's impossible, which I think part of the issue is with altruism is that in the edge cases, or the cases where someone is supposedly being altruistic for the benefit of society, if it's not immediately obvious that they're being altruistic, it's hard to guess their intentions, because there's another claim here, which is people who might act in a way which they claim to be altruistic or for the benefit of others may not actually be for the benefit of others, but rather for the benefit of themselves, but they don't know that consciously. There's some sort of subconscious, say, alignment there. Like, it just so happens that the benefit of other people involves selling the cars that I happen to own lots of stocks in. Or maybe the benefit of others involves, say, people switching to veganism because I have lots of stocks in, these vegan companies.
So that's an interesting argument, and I think that you can have two things. And I think you can be altruistic and also selfish at the same time, oddly. I think it can be symbiotic. And if you recognize that, then you can do things that benefit society. So if we take this away from the macro level, because I happen to agree with you, I don't think that we can ascertain if one political system is the cause of collapse or not, because there are so many factors, especially with today's globalized world. There's no way that you can say that there aren't outside influences, right? So what if we just take one example? And so in Atlas Shrugged, is the book that Ayn Rand wrote, essentially it's about a capitalist who invents a new type of ore. And so the government eventually steps in and says, you know what, we have to subsidize this. And he says, why should I have to? Because I invented it. And because I'm able to profit from it, I can reinvest in this and innovate further. Now, this is the basic sort of dichotomy between capitalism and socialism. And the argument always is that capitalism is going to lead to innovation. And many people conflate capitalism and selfishness, because selfishness tends to facilitate capitalism. So if we take this one example, we can apply it to Amazon, say, and would it be better if we, say, forced Amazon to break up and sort of distributed their gains to society? Or would it be better to allow them to continue to be massively profitable, but continue to innovate and bring products that make our lives easier?
Yeah. So that's a question which I think is kind of obvious with the answer, but I want to paint this in a different way. So
okay.
Imagine there's a guy named John, and John is the best thing in everything, right? He's just amazing, right? And he's a part of this local community, and let's say this community is a tribal community, but he can hunt, he can cook, he can give massages, he can do whatever you need him to. He can take care of babies, he can teach them, and he's just the best. And so everyone wants John's help with everything. And let's say one way of utilizing John is to have him do everything, right? The problem with having John do everything is that now he's not doing anything very well, because he can only do one thing at a time. if you spread John around, that specialization that he had, or not, that generalization he has, maybe he's good in everything. Now he can only get so good in anything because he's only cooking for like 15 minutes. He can't be that great of a cook in 15 minutes. He's only teaching for 15 minutes. He's doing a little bit of hunting, maybe catches 1 or 2 things, but if he was hunting for the whole day, he could have caught like, say 20 animals that could have fed them for like weeks and weeks and weeks. And I think the same thing with Amazon. So in the case of Amazon, you could say that maybe it would be better off spreading this around, and having this wealth distributed, or we can get the gains and spread it around. And there's a question to that, but the question is, are the gains that we're getting a result of someone who is some entity which is being a very general entity being able to focus on this one particular thing? And if we're to split this up into different segments, that this thing loses its focus, that now it's not able to achieve the things it would before, and those things that it was achieving before were beneficial to us. Now we're not getting any benefit or barely any benefit because the time or the segmentation just fractures that benefit across such a diverse field that it's now no longer that great for us.
Yeah, so if I'm reading you correctly, I think that you're making the argument for capitalism there, which I happen to agree with, that if we allow for free markets and we allow for people to pursue the skills that they are best at and focus on those skills, then they can best provide for society.
I don't even think it's the skills that they're best at. I think it's the skills that they want to do. But I think there's 2 different views of capitalism. There's one view which is that people ought to do what brings the most to society, and that's one view. And I think that's more view that is aligned with more classical capitalism. So I think John Locke and Ayn Rand and Adam Smith. So I think they'd be more in line with that view because they're more about the power of the individual and the individual triumphing. So that's what they tend to be more about. But I think kind of a more modern view of capitalism with that is, if someone wants to go home and play video games all day and do nothing with their life, although they might have capabilities to do great things, that's okay too, because that's their choice. It focuses on individual choice and maximizing that choice as opposed to maximizing some sort of utility for society.
Okay, that makes sense. So that it's sort of interesting because you presented 2 versions of selfishness there. And so this is the second part of our discussion, which is, is selfishness inherently bad, right? Mm-hmm. So we've kind of gotten to where we can say there's times where altruism isn't good, right? Like if you take and you force individuals to contribute to the collective, and you may therefore stifle innovation and potential that they might have otherwise given to society. So that's the potential bad in altruism. Now, the potential good in selfishness, right, is exactly what we're talking about with Amazon, is that if you allow for maximum individual freedom and autonomy, then the good parts of selfishness would inherently lead to innovation and growth because there's incentive for that person to create such innovation and growth.
Yeah, the way I kind of see it is that selfishness, or these words are tough. It's because there's selflessness and selfishness. They sound very similar. So let's just say altruism versus selfishness. So no selflessness. It's not that right there. But okay, so when you're selfish, you're not able to lie about being selfish as much as you can with being altruistic. If you say that something is for the benefit of other people and you're lying, that's hard to catch out. If you have the assumption that everyone's being selfish, that they're all trying to say put forward their own agenda and trying to go further with that, that's more mutually compatible with other people because now everyone has the same rules, the same game, and there's no potential for lying. There's only potential for catching someone out on their selfishness, right? You understand what they're playing for. So in a way, this is the irony, or this is like the paradox, because you have a system which is built on, say, good faith, and that system's gonna have very, very questionable integrity to it. If you have a system on, say, mistrust of others, that system is going to be very trustful because the only way it can operate is with extreme degrees of trust. And that trust happens through many different channels. And these channels are complex because it's typically legal channels, contracts, people will do a lot of things to ensure that this is going to be the case. Monetary exchange is one big thing. So what makes me believe I'm going to get some sort of thing when I hand someone $20 bill is that I'm handing them the $20 bill, right? And there's a certain trust in that, because for that to be, it's not that it couldn't go wrong. It obviously could. I could hand them that $20 bill and just keep it, right? But we've created a whole legal system around that of mistrust. So the mistrust is there, but we have ways of handling to make it symbiotic and
That's true.
I feel like I'm almost making this point clear, but I can't quite get there.
So you're talking about symbiotic, right? So how do we get selfishness and altruism to kind of come towards the center? Okay, I think that's what you're working towards.
So what I'm trying to say is, in a system where everyone is being says that they're being altruistic, it's hard to trust anybody because you don't know who's being altruistic, right? You don't know if they're lying or not. They're probably bullshitting, right? Because people can claim anything.
Yeah.
But if you have a system where everyone says they're being selfish, that system is far easier to navigate because everyone's being selfish. And if they're not, it doesn't hurt you.
That's true. And it's also interesting to note that in highly capitalist societies where selfishness is rewarded, it often leads to altruism automatically, which is actually another argument that Ayn Rand made, is that selfishness will actually lead to greater benefit than altruism, because altruism has no, in theory, has no production at the end of it, right? Or the argument is that, let's say that you give $2 million to a charity, but if instead of donating it, you'd taken that $2 million and invested it into your business and grew your business, and then maybe you created 50 more jobs, and then over time that generated more revenue that you could invest again and create more jobs. The argument is that if you use that capital selfishly to continue growing and growing, then eventually you might be the next Amazon, right? But if you donate that money instead, that money gets spent and then the production ends there. And so the argument for selfishness would really be that it becomes symbiotic with altruism, because if you want to promote yourself and progress yourself in society, to some degree you have to assimilate to society's expectations, and you have to provide a service for society, or they won't be willing to patron you or advance your own selfish agenda, right? Obviously there are versions of selfishness that are toxic, and that's, we can get into those too, but this sort of discussion of capitalism is just highlighting the parts of selfishness that are good.
Yeah. I think I got a better explanation for the previous point I was trying to make too.
Okay.
So a system that it claims to be, say, altruistic, you can't trust that system very well because you don't know who's lying. So that system, although it's supposed to be based off of, say, goodness, or say, being faithful and having goodwill towards others, that system is inherently not as trustable because people are going to be more likely to lie. If you have a system where everyone is being selfish, and even if people aren't being selfish, they're being altruistic, you can trust the system far more, because if they're being selfish, you know what to expect. So that system is far more trust. You can trust someone being selfish. If someone's being altruistic, you can trust that as well, because if someone's being altruistic, you still trust their altruism, right? So they're not mutually exclusive. So you can have far more trust in an altruistic system, or in a selfish system, like a more capitalistic system, than an altruistic system, because the fact that people will lie.
That's true, because you already know that everybody is, if you're in a selfish society, you know that the end goal is to advance the self, right? And so knowing that, you can either take steps to advance yourself, or you can reasonably expect what another person next to you is going to do, right? But what you're saying is, in an altruistic society where everybody's expected to contribute to the collective, there might be people who have underlying selfish motives, but you have no way of knowing because they're assimilating into the environment out of self-preservation, and then they might be surreptitiously doing something else. It's
kind of like, if you've ever been to like a conference, or had like a multi-level marketing scheme landed at you, like you hear it and you just hear all these benefits, all these great things about it, and you're like, okay, but what's in it for you, That's the question. If something sounds way too good to be true, like you have to figure out why.
Right, because people aren't giving you free stuff. So you're naturally skeptical because you know that you're in a selfish system.
Yeah.
And so you're more able to become guarded to those things. But if you're in a system where you assume that everything ought to be altruistic, and so then you're more willing to accept things as being in your best interest, right?
Yeah.
So if the government's telling you the reason why we're doing this is because it's in the best interest of society, because the basis of your society is altruism, you don't question that claim, and that claim might eventually harm you.
It can even be the case that maybe you trust that claim particularly because you have a good reason to, but all the other claims you're being made, you don't know if you can trust.
That's
right?
true.
Right? And maybe most of them you can, but let's say that there's even like, say, 5% you can't. Those 5% might be really fucked up things that will screw up everything.
Right.
You get just like, out of 100 people, just 5 bad actors. Those 5 bad people can destroy the society.
That's true. So, I mean, if there are good and bad parts of both altruism and selfishness, then it's safe to say that going too far in either direction would probably not be good for a society, right?
Probably. So it's hard for me to say exactly, because I think it depends on... It depends on where selfishness ends as well, because Ayn Rand... So I think we're more okay with Ayn Rand than most people. I don't think most people who criticize Ayn Rand have really read her, because she's very verbose in what she says, and some of the stuff she says is fucking crazy. So let me be very blunt with that. But a lot of stuff she says about selfishness, especially, it's just very like down to earth and logical and rational. I mean, there's a whole field of psychology now called rational self-interest. And it's kind of well accepted. I mean, it's just kind of... Most of what she was saying was this kind of rational self-interest. But she was being very blunt saying this is selfishness because she wanted... It's like clickbait, essentially.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she actually called her theory rational objectivism, which sounds an awful lot like what you're talking about now. And so, I mean, she did say some things that were crazy. But again, you have to take into account that she came from Soviet Russia. And... It was also a different time in United States history, too. So not all of it applies in 2020.
So she got prescribed diet pills that were meth, and she took a lot of them. And she started getting hallucinations, essentially.
Yeah, so...
But what she did or attempted to do in her works was to take this idea of self-interest and say that this could be applied universally across society and not only have society function, but it could have it, thrive. And I think the case that she made was pretty compelling. With that said, I think that it's the edge cases are where things get confusing, and I think that her theory of self-interest does allow those edge cases. So for someone who has no fault of their own, let's say someone was born without legs, or someone, a child has cancer, donating to a cause for that is good if it supports your self-interest. You shouldn't do it because there's some sort of expectation for you to, or because you want to be altruistic in her sense, but you want to do that because you want to see a world where there's not kids dying of cancer, right? Like that's something that you want to see, and this is the change you want to make with your monetary donations.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that makes sense, and it's a good segue because I think really the last thing that I want to dissect here is where do we need to draw the line? So let's say that we have a capitalist society and we say that not all selfishness is bad. In fact, we need to build some of it into our system of belief. Then we have to figure out on what points do we encourage altruism in society and how do we work that in? So, and this is the big debate because you have people that talk about, for example, healthcare, whether healthcare should be a right or whether it should be privatized. And that really is a question of altruism versus selfishness, right? Is it okay for people to profit off of healthcare, or is it something that should inherently be just altruistic?
So I'm actually going to debate that point here, that it would be altruistic, like free healthcare, because like we were talking before, like with socialism and communism, it can't be altruistic inherently because there's a level of involuntariness involved in the reciprocating party. So the parties involved, they're not just getting something for free. They have to either pay into taxes or they have to be subject to the laws of the United States. There's certain like catches to it. It's not just like a gift. It's a two-way street as far as that goes. So I don't think, by definition, it could be altruistic.
Okay, you're right. So we can't assign altruism to Medicare for all, but let's say that we say that selfishness is the greatest virtue. And I'm not saying that's what we're saying, but let's say that that's the argument you make, and that capitalism should be untethered, and that we don't want to go the way of socialism, okay? So how do you respond to the claim that healthcare is a right? And if we did, you're right, we would have to do something. So if we tax people against their will to pay for Medicare, and like you and I, well, I mean, more so myself, I'm a healthy young person who doesn't need healthcare. You, on the other hand, might need it, right? Mm-hmm. So what sort of tenet should I apply to that? Like, should I have to pay my tax dollars so that somebody else can have healthcare?
I think if you want. I'm definitely more libertarian on this. I'm not saying libertarian because I don't like labels, and I don't agree with. I think you get kind of pigeonholed if you say you have this, because I'm more than just that. Like, I have many varying ideas about many different things, and I don't have one general philosophy on politics. So I want to make that clear. But I don't think that anyone should have an obligation to pay anything for me. So I require insulin. I'm type 1 diabetic, and if I don't get this insulin, I will die. And I think the best way to handle this is not to have other people subsidize, at the force of a gun. But I think the best solution to this is to have people, donate voluntarily. Now, part of the issue, and this is, I think, part of the problems that we're talking about earlier, is that when you have a system that is giving, say, money, and I don't want to say handouts, but it's giving, doling out resources on a basis of need, it's a complex system because the basis of those needs could influence the rate of those things happening. So, for instance, if you reward people for having children out of wedlock, or children who don't have fathers, or I'm not saying reward because that's not the right term. If you give them assistance, that assistance might be necessary and good and needed for the child, but then there's also the other side of the coin is that going to increase the rate of people having children, without fathers, or without parents, or not without parents, but having mindless sex and accidentally getting pregnant? Is that going to influence those rates? Because I would argue it does, based off certain data and everything. But there's certain incentives that are given by certain laws, and those incentives will affect that. And I think you have to be careful with that, and that's why I think that a system like that is very hard to manage if it's based on force, because in the case that is the instance, it's very hard to stop that. Whereas if it's a voluntary contribution, such as a donation, then you can potentially fix that issue.
So let's say we extend that out to other sectors of society. So if we assert that there shouldn't be taxation to pay for healthcare, that it should be privatized, and you should have an option if you want to donate to other people's healthcare needs or specific research cases, or whatever it is. Let's extend that out, because we do have socialized systems already. Mm-hmm. And I realize that in this argument, I'm taking socialism and assuming that it always equals altruism, which isn't exactly true by the definition we've come up with. But what we can say is that it's a form of distributive justice, right? Mm-hmm. That you're taking a service that we consider a right, and we're giving it to everybody in society, and in return, everybody's paying a little bit in. So you've got police, and you've got firefighters, and you've got EMTs. These are all people who are paid for by our taxes as well. So what would make those different than healthcare, for example?
So I think one instance that's different from that is okay. Here's a question, because I don't know if there's a difference technically. So in an instance of, say, healthcare being a right, you could say that if someone is injured and they're not even a U.S. citizen, that they have a right to medical access. The right to that. It's not the same in the case. This is a tangential point, but like let's say that you don't pay your taxes and your house is on fire. Like the fire people will come. They'll make sure the fire doesn't spread to other houses, but you're fucked. You didn't pay your taxes. They're not going to put your house out.
So that's an important distinction, because now what we're actually talking about is a social contract. So you're talking about an exchange of goods that you freely accept.
Mm-hmm.
So when you pay for home insurance, you are freely accepting that you are paying out this money, and if something happens, then the exchange is that you are covered, right?
Yeah.
And so we pay taxes, and in exchange we expect to have police and firefighters and EMTs.
Yeah.
So some people argue that should extend to healthcare, and whether that's true is a whole other debate that would probably take an entire podcast. But the point is that it's not altruism. So this is the distinction. If you have some socialist institutions like fire stations or police force, it's not altruism by its structure. It's actually a mutual exchange of goods.
Yeah.
Taxes for services. So it's actually still selfishness in a way, because if you wanted to, you could opt out. You could go live in a homestead and not pay any of these taxes.
I mean, so I want to make this metaphor too blunt, but it's a forcible exchange of goods. So it's not a voluntary exchange of goods, because you don't have a choice not to pay your taxes. It's the same way like the mob might come to your shop and say, hey, we'll give you protection if you pay us some money. I.e., if we don't pay us money, we're going to fuck you up. But if anyone else tries to fuck you up, we'll fuck them up, right? So there's an exchange going on there, and you don't have a choice in that exchange, but you still get some benefit from that exchange.
So, yeah, okay, that's right technically, because I think what I was really trying to get at is that you don't have to be part of the mainstream society. That if you wanted to like live in a tent, technically you could do that. But you're right. If you want to be part of mainstream society, the taxes on certain things are not optional. Yeah. But stuff like health insurance, except during the Obamacare years, but stuff like if you want to buy health insurance, if you want to buy car insurance in certain states like New Hampshire, right? Those are optional things that you're willingly paying into. So actually those aren't altruistic.
No, they're definitely health insurance is definitely capitalistic. I would definitely say, and it's just risk management, and I disagree. Okay, I don't want to get too much into health insurance type stuff. Yeah, but I disagree with the idea of positive rights in general, but specifically that healthcare should be a right. And if people in the comments disagree, I like disagreements. Let's have a debate, because I think it's important to debate about this. I don't think you're stupid, and if you think I'm stupid, I mean, just hear what I have to say. It's okay if we disagree. Disagreement's good. But I don't like the idea of a positive right, because what you're saying is that someone who has certain skills, who is doing something, has an obligation to provide you something. And I don't like that, because whether that person attains those skills or goes into that profession is a choice in their end. It's a choice that they're making. So we could say that we're saying when you say healthcare should be free is that, or healthcare should be universalized, is that doctors and nurses should have to give healthcare regardless of whether they want to. They should be able to give it. They have to get it free of charge. They can also say there's a system to compensate them fairly for that, so they could involved in it as well. But then what if those people just don't like that system, and people just stop becoming doctors and stop becoming nurses, and there's no medical professionals, because it doesn't mandate that people become those things. It just mandates that if someone becomes one of those things and tries to provide those services, that they can't charge for it, or if they charge, or that they have to get paid from the government. It's just mandating that, and I think it's important to be careful about the structures we kind of institute, because it's like these people who are providing medical service, they don't have to provide medical service. They can do whatever they want. They can quit becoming a doctor. They can pursue other fields, and saying that they have to provide this service, they have to do this thing for you because they have this ability or there's these skills. I mean, it's not even that they have those abilities, it's that have those abilities and they're practicing.
That's true. If
one more point. If, let's say that healthcare was universal in the United States, but then all the doctors and nurses quit, it's a moot point.
That's true.
Yeah, it's universal now, but you need people who are willing to do that thing for you. And I don't think it's good to forcibly say, increment these people to act in the way that you want because you want them to provide the service for free or for a price that you want them to provide it for. I think they have the choice whether they should do that or not.
I think there's definitely strong points in both directions. Because I mean, one argument that you could make is that there are industries that they're already controlled by the government largely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, public schools are one example, and there's a lot of issues that could be debated about public schools. And certainly, you see that public school teachers are underpaid. So it's likely that you would see a similar trend with, especially nurses and EMTs and like the medical personnel that maybe require 2 to 4 years of school and not 12. What you would see is that the government would have to provide heavy incentives for those 12-year degrees, because if all of a sudden we have Medicare for all and the private insurance companies that are paying, I mean, just keeping in mind that Medicare only reimburses a 70% rate. So private insurance is subsidizing a lot of that for hospitals, which are for-profit organizations. So if you're talking about getting highly skilled individuals that require 12-year degrees, I mean, you're going to have to create incentive programs. So essentially you're capitalizing the creation of these highly skilled professions within a socialist system. So it doesn't make sense. And you know, when a lot of people say that Denmark is a great example of a socialist country, exact same thing. Denmark is actually a capitalist country that has socialist systems woven in. So, like, on its face, you have to have selfishness present in order to incentivize people to do things that are good for society. You can't have rampant selfishness, and that's why you have to have certain institutions like hospitals, police force, fire station, things like that. You have to have that stuff, but you also have to incentivize people to want to pay for it. Like, they have to get something for it, and you have to incentivize the people who are going to go out and do it, right? So you really have to have a blend of these two things, and you have to understand that by our nature, humans are inherently selfish. So if you create situations where that selfishness would lead to altruism, then that's the best case scenario for society.
Yeah, I think we can agree on that. If let's say the goals of altruism are, say, to benefit society as a whole, and maybe also respect, say, personal rights, like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, whatever those rights are, I think we can say that the best case scenario would be one in which selfishness results in altruistic, or say altruistic systems, right? Like selfishness produces altruism. I think that's probably the best result that could happen, like, because that result is based on selfishness, which is more, I'd say it's more trustable. It's a better foundation because it's harder to lie in that sort of.
Yes, just like here's a really base level example, just to sum up what we're saying. Like, let's say that you have a boss and an employee, okay? And the employee works really hard, but not because the employee wants to give their labor to the company or the boss, because the employee wants to advance their career and make more money for their family, right? So what happens is the boss benefits from that person's labor because it makes the boss look good. So then the boss in turn gives the employee a raise. But the boss isn't giving the employee a raise because they want to give away money. They're doing it because they want the employee to continue to perform well. And so this symbiotic relationship actually is all related to selfishness, but produces the perception of altruism, which is that employees all get bonuses, we all get raises, and we can then turn around and give that money to our families or to people who need it more, that maybe can't work, right? And all the while we're paying taxes, and some of those taxes are going into Social Security and disability and systems for people who aren't able to produce the same kind of labor. So, like, really, it's all based on selfishness. And so when people say that selfishness is bad, actually, I disagree.
Yeah, I think even more basic example of that is, so for instance, back in the Industrial Revolution, there was a huge outcry about children working in factories. And certainly children working in factories is not a good thing. But it's kind of strange that there's an outcry, given that for the last thousands and thousands of years, children have always worked. They work at a very young age. Also, they tend to die. They tend to die a lot. But, a child might be working out in the field by age 3 or 4, right? It's just kind of what was needed for living. And the fact of the matter is, once the Industrial Revolution started occurring and we had these factories, people actually started making a lot more money and they started living longer and also started to be able to provide for their family in a way where child labor wasn't necessary. It's something that was necessary before, but now the fact that it maybe wasn't necessary now, it allowed it to be abolished. It allowed for it to become an issue. And so you can say there's certain moral features, such as caring for the poor or caring for people who aren't able to care for themselves. There's definitely people out there. I come across people at the gym a lot who, the gym I go to, it's more of a, it's actually from a hospital. It's a hospital type gym, is the way to put it. It's sponsored by a hospital, so there's a lot of people with a lot of disabilities that are there trying to improve their fitness. And these people, they can't do anything on their own. They can't live on their own. And those people definitely need that help. Those people would not get the help back in the day because those people would just be either beggars on the street, like most likely die, probably just stolen from their family, maybe even thrown off the bridges and stuff. Like they would just be disregarded and not make it. And the fact that we have accumulated such wealth that we now are in a position to address this as even being a problem is kind of a sign of we have the wealth now to address the issue. We now have the benefits of, say, capitalism. We have the money, we have the resources that we can now spend it on these issues, on these people that actually need the help that they would need. But I think it's important to realize that the reason why we have that is because of the initial benefits and gains that we made, and that you can't disregard that as if we've always had those benefits and gains. We're addressing this problem because we have the golden goose that's laying the eggs. And it's important not to cut off that goose's head, rather to keep the goose laying the eggs, that we have more money to solve more problems that we didn't even know existed.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better.
I went on a little rant there, but... That's
absolutely perfect. And so I think we should probably wrap things up. But, just to summarize, we were on the same page about a lot. And I think it's gray. There's no one answer for this. I think that with altruism and selfishness, there are good aspects of it, and there are certainly bad aspects. I don't think you can go too far in either direction in a society. I think you have to have a blend of both. But if I only had the option of choosing one or the other to form the basis of my systems, I would choose selfishness, because I think that if you start with selfishness, it will lead to greater benefit for society.
Yeah, and I agree with that as well. And I think something that, if you do disagree with us online, again, that's fine. But you have to take our motives or our ends into consideration, because our ends are most likely the same. It's not that, if I'm promoting a capitalist system, my claim is not that people should die in the streets because they can't help themselves, but rather it's that we should accumulate enough wealth to be able to help people through a stringent and reliable system, as opposed to okay, it's a difference in methodology, let's put it this way. So I have my method of addressing this problem. This is what I believe based off the evidence. You might believe other things based off the evidence as well, and that's where the debate happens, but the end is the same. We both want people who have no ability to care for themselves to get the help. For people who have medical issues, who can't, say, treat those issues on their own, who have disabilities, who have any sort of issues like that, people who actually have legitimate claims, we want them to get help. And probably the same people that you're talking about, if you're disagreeing with this online. So it's not that we don't have the same goals, it's that we have a different end. And that end you're claiming might be result in the opposite of what we're claiming it does. And also, we're claiming that your end might result, or your means might result in the opposite as well. But the fact that they just are disambiguous doesn't matter, because we're trying to get to the same place. And that's where the conversation needs to happen, is the means, not the end.
Yeah, 100%. That goes back to the importance of dialogue, which was our first episode. And I think just one analogy really sums everything up here, which is that, if you're on an airplane that's going down, you have to put your own mask on first. And that is my explanation for why I would choose selfishness over altruism, because if you don't have your mask on, then maybe you could put someone else's mask on, but your ability to do so is going to be inhibited. And So the end goal for everybody on the plane is to survive the crash, right?
Yeah.
But how we get there we might disagree. But like Nathan said here, like keep in mind, we're not saying that capitalism should be untethered and that the rich should get richer and the poor should get poorer. No, we're not talking about that. We have mutual goals. I just think that we might disagree on how to get there.
I do disagree about one thing with that, though. I think the rich should get richer. I think I should get incredibly rich. I think I should become super rich. I'm saying I'm rich right now. Well, guess what? After this podcast, bring in the money. I'll take it.
I'll second that. Come to think of it, let's all get rich.
No, I want the poor to get poorer, though. You, Patrick.
Dang, well.
Well, this was Does Anything Matter? You can find us right here on YouTube, or we're going to be on some other site by the time this comes out. Who knows? I was deciding like 5 podcasts in. Probably start a podcast, or we'll see a podcast next week or some week, I don't know, from a co-collaboration we did with We Need to Talk, which I am a co-host on as well. Patrick came on for an episode, and we talked about dicks. It's a very long conversation, and we explored all the avenues that we could.
Yeah, so check it out. It's pretty exciting.
Catch you guys next time.
See ya.